You know, a lot of times people talk about immigration relief as a protection from deportation, and most times people talk about that in the context of naturalization, adjustment of status. But for many criminalized communities, immigration relief and protection from deportation is actually through other reliefs, such as criminal justice reforms that completely prevent our communities from ending up in the system in the first place. The state of California in particular, over 90% of people that have been detained or deported have had some interaction with the criminal legal system. So that means that here in California, the direct pipeline to deportation is the criminal legal system. And so what that tells us is that if we know that the main arms of ICE is actually local law enforcement, this actually lets us know that we need to strengthen our efforts with our criminal justice partners and build more cross-sector organizing and strategies that actually protect criminalized communities from not only being exploited by the criminal legal system, but also by the immigration enforcement system.
Well, the reality is that for too long we allowed ourselves to live in these artificial silos, or believe rather in these artificial silos, where you were fighting for immigrant rights or you were fighting for criminal justice. And we neglected to look at the fact that these fights are not separate at all. What's unique in California is that we have really built up the muscle at the base in order to hold electeds accountable. And we have done enough organizing for the last 2-3 decades to start building real power in the state legislative branch. So what we found is that we suddenly have the opportunity to really move a statewide agenda that decriminalizes all impacted communities. So we partnered with criminal justice allies on a number of different legislative reforms that expanded access to what we call post-conviction relief, or another way to put that is an effective way of clearing your record so that that record no longer stands as a hurdle, keeping you from whatever it is you want to do, whether that's getting a job or remaining here in the United States. And then we worked with our criminal justice allies to implement those laws. So trained public defenders in how to represent people in post-conviction relief motions, trained the nonprofit immigration legal service providers about how to show up in criminal court. We effectively advocated that state funding needed to be devoted to post-conviction relief attorneys. So this notion of a good immigrant or bad immigrant, or some people being okay to be left behind, we threw that out here in California. And instead what we did was center our advocacy around those who have been most criminalized and who have been most marginalized, and under this theory that a rising tide will lift all boats. And as we protect the hell out of their rights, that will have ripple effects that will lead to better outcomes for all of us.
Speaking from having been thrown under the bus, man, that bus is heavy. That bus is heavy, rolls over you really, really hard. I think in terms of like policy-wise, you know, there's been a lot of conversations here in California, right? In moving us forward into a place where folks can find ways out, right? Not necessarily just through pardons, but folks are now starting to be able to access things a little bit more, right? Folks are able to go get convictions overturned in some instances, right? Taking bad plea deals or whatever, right? Being able to go back and say, nah, man, that was a bad deal, getting a better deal. Something that's immigration safe, if you want to call it that. You know, those are wins. Wins in terms of other folks getting pardons that have not been out, 10 years. Those are all wins too, right? Being able to get a governor to really think about things a little bit more broadly, right? That's also a win.
I actually didn't know like who DAs were or what they do for a long time, and then most people don't actually, unless like you get arrested for something, you get charged, and you see like the DA is the guy who's trying to put you away for life. You know, prosecutors have gotten significant latitude and discretion in terms of, you know, what to charge people with and what to sentence people with, and what kind of enhancements to seek, and kind of the expansion of that is what has led for the number of people who are incarcerated to increase when crime has actually been decreasing. That, you know, what we argue is that, you know, the role that prosecutors have played has contributed significantly to mass incarceration. And, you know, DAs, prosecutors, they are elected. They're elected county by county. There's about, I think, 2,300 elected, you know, district attorneys. In some places, they call them state's attorneys or you know, prosecuting attorneys. They're elected by county, and then, you know, they set the policy, and they're supposed to reflect, you know, the will of the people. And in California, what you see is, you know, the public, the voters, you know, the community is moving towards, you know, criminal justice reform, is moving towards, you know, taking away, you know, different mechanisms through which, you know, prosecutors criminalize communities, and primarily Black and brown communities. But the elected DAs have actually been going the other way, or like refusing to listen to their own voters in many places. So, you know, I think the reason why it's important to do DA work is because DAs are responsible for mass incarceration. They're responsible for feeding the, you know, massive deportation system that this country has, and they don't have to, right?
So what we did was partnered with our criminal justice allies to create the first law in the country requiring prosecutors to consider the immigration consequences of crimes. This meant that instead of showing up in the court and saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not going to consider the long-term immigration impact of this charge on the defendant, now prosecutors are required to consider that in their charging, plea bargaining, and post-conviction decisions.
You know, one of the demands is that DAs should not be involved in the parole process, because the thing that they know most about is the offense at the front end, right, and the evidence. The purpose of a parole hearing is to determine, is this person rehabilitated enough to come back to the community? Do they pose a risk to the community? And should they come home, right? That has nothing to do with the offense. Like, the premise of those questions is actually like redemption and rehabilitation, right? And so DAs know nothing about that, and they should not be involved in that process, right? The end to like seeking sentences like LWAP, life without parole sentences. You know, for DAs to not charge a lot of like low-level petty offenses, some of which get people deported, right? You know, to divert significant amount of people who really should not be in the criminal legal system, who have either substance use issues or like poverty-related issues or other issues, social issues, you know, that are better, you know, dealt with through social services as opposed to through the criminal systems.
California wastes billions of dollars of tax revenue on jails, prisons, detention centers. And, you know, I think it's important for everyone to understand that all of these places were built to solve problems that are actually socioeconomic. Too many people have fallen victim to California's culture of abandonment and austerity. And shifting our fiscal priorities from cages to care will provide this relief that we need to our most vulnerable community members and establish long-term cost-saving infrastructure that California needs to address some of its most imperative crises. Most importantly, I think, is that divesting from incarceration and investing in the wellness of our state's residents will undoubtedly save the lives of countless people both inside and outside of cages.
Budgets to Save Lives effort allows us to challenge California state leaders, to challenge their values and their morals by saying, you know, this is a platform that you've run with, right? And this is how you can put that platform into practice by actually putting power back and resources back into our communities.
Seeing the through line and understanding that, you know, these issues are in fact interrelated, and making space for our coalitions to intersect. We always say, you know, Budget to Save Lives is a campaign, not a coalition, but really we're a coalition of coalitions in certain respects, and creating that interconnectivity between all of our communities has, you know, so much value. And I think, you know, the more opportunities philanthropy has to support that is meaningful. The more opportunities that we have as a community, as a culture, to understand the interrelatedness of these issues is so meaningful. I think LA County is kind of looked at as an incubator. And as an LA County organizer, I think that really that's what's been driving processes like the Alternatives to Incarceration process, like our success with Measure J, asking ourselves, what are these models, right? What are these exportable models that we can take to other counties? What are these exportable models that we can take statewide? And California is a leader, is a progressive leader, but in actuality, if you look at California's history, we're not exactly the most progressive state on incarceration, on immigrant detention, on policing. So I think really there is a progressive awakening to a certain extent in California, where folks who maybe thought it was one way are realizing it's another, and hopefully we're moving towards a budget that will more directly align with our actual values.
And I think what we've been able to do is to really be in such close partnership and like relationship with each other that like we sit down together and think together about what should be the demand, how should it be written so that it can include everybody that we care about, right? And specifically, how can these like, you know, criminal justice reforms and policies and laws we want, how can they be written in a way that they capture like all non-citizen folks, like all the immigrants, so that they can benefit from this, right? And that has just allowed us to be a lot more stronger, you know, a lot more cohesive, and, you know, be effective, like in ways that affect like people materially on a regular basis.
Doing this, there's been a lot of wins. I want to say there's tangible wins, and there are also wins that, you know, you can't like grasp, right? Community education, community power, community building, movements coming together, etc. Right? Those are all wins too. Like individual people not being deported, etc. Those are all wins, right? Families being able to stay together, you know, seeing young people that I work with that have reached out for support, getting support, right? And saying, man, you know, thank you for helping keep my mom and dad here with me. Right? These are all wins, right? But people tend to always look at policies, right? But sometimes we have to go beyond that and look bigger to see, you know, the wins that we have for our people. Man, you know, those are amazing things.